Okay, welcome everyone. The presentation is about to begin. This session will be recorded and will last about 60 minutes. Please keep your mic muted during presentation. And if you have question, comment, please enter in the chat box during presentation. And your question will be addressed by the presenter at the end. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within a few days after the live event. Again, welcome everyone. My name is Qing Lin. I'm the chair of TESOL's bilingual and multilingual interest section. I would like to extend my warmest welcome to all of you for coming to this webinar titled Envisioning TESOL Through a Translanguaging Lens. This webinar is part of TESOL's B-MEIS webinar series dedicated to reimagining multilingual education in the era of changing global landscapes. Given that there has been a growing scholarly literature dedicated to translanguaging, the goal of today's webinar is to dive deeper into issues relating to this growing field and examine the impact of it on the larger field of TESOL. All of our speakers today have extensive expertise in translanguaging theory and practices. The session will be moderated by Dr. Zhongfen Tian. So I'm going to introduce him, and he in turn will introduce the speakers. Dr. Zhongfen Tian is an assistant professor in TESOL teacher education, applied linguistics at the University of Texas at San Antonio, United States. He has edited 3 editorial volumes relating to translanguaging. The first one is a special issue titled Positive Synergy, Translanguaging and Critical Theory in Education with Holly Link for the Translation and the Translanguaging in Multilingual Contexts journal. The second one is an edited volume titled English Medium Instruction and Translanguaging. And the third edited volume is titled Envisioning TESOL Through a Translanguaging Lens, that this webinar is named after. So both edited volumes are forthcoming. Okay, now without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor to Dr. Zhongfen Tian. Dr. Zhongfen Tian.
Thank you, Qing. Can everybody hear me well? Yeah, yes. I'm gonna stop sharing this flyer and start to share my screen with you all. So hello everyone. My name is Zhongfen. I'm currently assistant professor at UT San Antonio, and thank you everybody for your passion and interest in joining this webinar, wherever you are in different regions of the world. So let me just quickly share my screen with you all first. So can everybody see it? Yeah, so as you all may know, we just published an edited volume on this topic called Envisioning TESOL Through a Translanguaging Lens, Global Perspectives. And we are willing to have a book raffle for today as a surprise. So if you are interested in entering your name in winning a book, so here's the link where you can click on the link and then input your names there, and we will do the raffle behind the scene, and winners will be announced in the end. So let me just, hold on. Let me just put a link in the chat box so that everyone can have access to the link. Can everybody see the link in the chat box? Yeah.
Yes, okay.
So today we're going to feature 4 presentations about envisioning TESOL through a translanguaging lens on this topic. And each presentation will be about 10 minutes. And I will be moderating the Q&A session later. And then we will announce the winners for the book raffle. So hopefully we will be having an engaging session today. And thank you again for all of your support and interest. So I'm going to start. So my topic is envisioning TESOL through a translanguaging lens. So I'm going to talk about some theoretical underpinnings underlying this concept of translanguaging and what translanguaging can bring to TESOL as transformation. So as you can see, this is my agenda. I'm going to start talking about my positionality and my story with translanguaging. I'm also going to give you guys a brief introduction of our edited volume, and then talk about what a translanguaging lens is and what a translanguaging lens could bring to TESOL, and how translanguaging can function as transformative tools in TESOL. So I always start my presentation with my positionality, because to me, research is professional, but it is also personal. It relates to my personal story. That's why I'm interested in this topic of translanguaging. So a little bit about myself. I'm originally from China. I was born and raised in China. And then I think 5 years ago, I came to the United States. I first got my master's degree in TESOL from Boston University. And then I got my PhD degree from Boston College. And now I'm an assistant professor at UT San Antonio. I consider myself as a multilingual speaker of Mandarin English with receptive fluency in Cantonese. And I've been working with multilingual and multicultural learners for many years. I was an English teacher in China, and then in Cambodia, and then in United States. So before I learned about the concept of translanguaging, I have years of experience as being English learner myself and also English teacher. One thing I keep encountering is the concept of native speaker or non-native English speakers, this kind of label. So this kind of phenomenon of native speakerism. So as an English learner, we always ask to acquire the target forms of native-like forms. And we always got compared with native speakers. We questioned about our accent, our use of English. And also as an English teacher, as you know, job market, they always prefer native English speakers. So I found this really problematic. And sometimes I even internalized this kind of deficit point of view to question myself, to see, am I good enough? My English sort of can never be good enough from this deficit point of view. However, when I encountered this concept of translanguaging, I think learning about translanguaging is a self-affirmation and self-empowerment process. So translanguaging, this concept that really talk about, it legitimizes language mixing performances. This is who we are. This is part of my identity. So language mixing is no longer associated with social stigma. It is part of our natural language practices. And translanguaging as pedagogy, it also supports multilingual classrooms. It purposefully invites students to bring their cultural and linguistic funds of knowledge into classrooms. So that's why I got really interested and passionate about this concept of translanguaging, which I'm gonna unpack that further in my later part of this presentation. That's why I think I'm gonna bring this concept to transform TESOL. I'm gonna let people know about, engage with this concept. I wanna multilingual learners benefit from this concept or this pedagogy. And then I found a group or a community of like-minded people, Layla, Peter, and Jamie. So we started to have conversation, I think 3 years ago, and we wanted to do a collective volume to dive into this issue. How can we envision TESOL through a translanguaging lens? So as you can see, monolingual bias continues to dominate the profession of TESOL. So such as the privileging of linguistic purism, the differential idealization of native over non-native speakers, the suppression of speakers of other languages in favor of the idealized target language norms. And then we came together as editors. We want to offer one possibility to envision TESOL through a translanguaging lens. We wanted to question, challenge, and deconstruct the underlying monolingual bias in TESOL. And we want to urge the field of TESOL to embrace multilingualism and multiculturalism as central rather than auxiliary, and to be culturally and linguistically sustaining instead of dominating. So as you can see from the picture, this is we had a session at the 2019 TESOL convention in Atlanta, and we took a group picture. I guess I just miss in-person conferences sometimes, yeah. And in this volume, we have three clear goals. So we want to open critical conversations on how to conceptualize and implement translanguaging in TESOL teacher education and classrooms of various contexts. We also want to call upon different educational stakeholders from different parts of the world to jointly reflect upon the opportunities and challenges of applying a translanguaging lens for cultural and linguistic pluralism in TESOL. And finally, we want to contribute to generating more authentic, sustainable, and contextualized knowledge for the whole field to help us move the field forward. How can we design translanguaging pedagogies, and how can we theorize translanguaging in TESOL? And we couldn't do this work on our own. We have a whole community of scholars supporting us behind. Here is just some acknowledgements from us. We want to definitely acknowledge Ophelia Garcia. We think her theorization of the notion of translanguaging was instrumental in our own thinking. We also want to thank Frances Hott, the educational linguistic series editor at Springer, for providing this platform and opportunity for us to have conversation with the whole field to envisioning TESOL through a translanguaging lens. And we also want to thank all the contributing authors. As you can see, their names are there. And some of them, I think they are with us today in this webinar, and you are welcome to contact them in the future. So I want to say thank you to all of you for your time and efforts in this project, and for your passion to moving an equitable TESOL teaching and learning forward. And now I'm going to begin to unpack, so what a translanguaging lens is. I think to us, translanguaging is not an object. It's not a thing itself. It's more like a perspective, a lens to provide us with new insights, to theorize what language is and how can we do better job in language in education. So for us, I think, as you can see, there are many literature talking about translanguaging, and translanguaging has many different definitions. And our understanding based on the literature, we think translanguaging lens can be described as a multifaceted three-layer lens, and we conceptualize translanguaging lens as a descriptive lens, translanguaging as practice and meaning-making process to describe bilinguals' meaning-making practices. And translanguaging is also a linguistic theory. And finally, translanguaging is also a pedagogical lens. It's a flexible bio-multilingual pedagogy. And we also want to be clear that our take-up of translanguaging doesn't necessarily replace, criticize, or reject the other extant theoretical orientations. Because we know there are tensions, there are other debates about translanguaging and code switching, how these two different and how they are similar. So we want to say we acknowledge the tradition of code switching with scholarship in our field, and they are different, but no one is trying to replace another. So we just feel like translanguaging lens could better capture our perspective to transform the TESOL profession. And we also want to acknowledge that the development of translanguaging research is built upon and will continue to enrich the long-held dialogues and debates about home and community languages and embracing a multilingual TESOL. So translanguaging as a descriptive lens, as I said, so it pretty much describes us how bilinguals or how multilinguals make sense of their bilingual words in their daily lives. So Garcia 2009 give a definition. So translanguaging as multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual words. And Levey also give another definition. We look at language not as a noun, but as a verb. And languaging focus on the ongoing meaning negotiation process, and translanguaging, the trans perfects, suggesting go beyond, transcend. Multilinguals, they make their meaning-making process not just simply goes between languages, but goes beyond them, and also goes beyond cognitive and semiotic system. So translanguaging as a descriptive lens, it really emphasizes the agency of multilingual speakers or users. We focus on how they actually do bi or multilingualism, and translanguaging is characterized as multilingual, multimodal, multisemiotic, and multisensory performance. And translanguaging is also a linguistic theory. So as a linguistic theory, it recognizes bilinguals this unitary, holistic linguistic repertoire, instead of positioning that they have two or more separate linguistic codes or systems. So it really challenges this bounded code view of language. And it acknowledges that languages, named languages, these are socially, politically constructions. So, and it recognized the material effects of those constructions, but more than that, it seeks to dismantle those categories and counters ideologies that we position one named language as superior to others. So it's trying to challenge the colonial and modernist era structuralist ideologies of language standardization. And finally, translanguaging as a pedagogical lens. So we know the original definition, translanguaging is developed by Sim Williams. It refers to an alternation of languages of input and output in Welsh English bilingual context to refer to a bilingual pedagogy. And then Alfredo Garcia extended this notion to refer to teachers and students engaged in home language practices of students in order to make sense of teaching to develop their academic language practices. And we also believe that translanguaging as pedagogy also has the potential to transform the relationship, to build community, to necessitate a co-learning space in classrooms where we celebrate linguistic and cultural diversity and ultimately to advance a social justice agenda. So when we apply translanguaging lens to TESOL, so what promises that translanguaging could bring to TESOL? As I said, the monolingual bias continue to dominate in TESOL, and we see there are three major manifestations. So usually monolingual bias is manifested as English as a monolithic entity. There's one pure English thing, and there's also native speakerism as a pervasive ideology. And also there's English only as monolingual approaches in the field of TESOL. So we think these three lenses of translanguaging, descriptive, theoretical, and pedagogical lens, they have the power and promises to challenge those three monolingual bias. So as a descriptive lens, we see translanguaging really emphasize how bilinguals make sense that the practice, language as social practice and meaning processes. So we see English as not as a prescribed static system of prescribed grammatical and pragmatic rules. It is not just one thing. So we focus on how people do or practice English. So English, actually, it has different varieties. We celebrate the heterogeneous nature of English, and people construct English in a process. So we propose this concept of Englishing. So Englishing. So English is always in a fluid state of being and becoming with multiple grammars, vocabulary, accents, and pragmatic discourse conventions. And we also see translanguaging as a theoretical lens. It has the power to dismantle this native versus non-native false dichotomy. So we really see translanguaging to unpack the power behind those labels. So the reason we have those labels as native or non-native speakers is we want to keep the power in the hands of a few. So native speakers or standardized English, these are all social and politically constructed entities to maintain certain people's power. So translanguaging as a theory is trying to question the structuralist ideologies of this language standardization and legitimizes varieties of English. And finally, we see translanguaging as pedagogy could counteract the English-only monolingual approaches. So we position students not as deficient non-natives lacking English proficiency, but we see them as complete people. They are resourceful agents with multilingual repertoires and abilities that could be utilized as resources in classrooms. And the goal of English teaching and learning is no longer acquiring the native-like form of English and becoming another monolingual. We think in TESOL, the goal of TESOL should help people to become a competent multilingual language user who are aware of the content, but also who has the linguistic creativity and criticality. So we want to see, in order to transform the field of TESOL, we think we want to urge all different parties to work together, to come together. So as you can see from this diagram, so in the early stage, this diagram may follow a top-down linear development that researchers, we first theorize translanguaging in TESOL, and then as teacher educators, we introduce them in TESOL education programs, and then teachers, they implement translanguaging, they try out translanguaging pedagogy in classroom. It may also follow up a bottom-up process. So teachers, they try out translanguaging pedagogies and then provide insights for theorizing translanguaging in TESOL. But we want to see a more dynamic, non-linear and fluid and complex process of all the parties working together. So they all go beyond their own boundaries. Researchers, they work with teacher educators. They work with pre and in-service teachers together. They work side by side to achieve a holistic, professional TESOL researcher practitioner perspective to jointly reimagine and reshape a translanguage TESOL profession with a social justice agenda. So finally, I just want to say, so we actually structure our volume based on the 3 parts. So this will just give you a brief overview of the content of our book. So we have part 1, theorizing translanguaging in TESOL, and we also have theorizing translanguaging in TESOL in teacher education, and part 3 is translanguaging in TESOL classrooms. So that's pretty much about my presentation. I'm gonna hand the floor to the second presentation. Peter.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Zhangfen. I'm not Layla, you may have noticed, but Layla's not here today, and I'm presenting for Layla. I was her co-author on this chapter. So I want to acknowledge Layla and say thank you to her for putting this together. She was one of the co-editors, and that this presentation is based on data from her dissertation and kind of the direction we took that. So anyway, I wanted to say hi to everyone. I'm speaking to you from my basement here in Columbus, Ohio. I want to acknowledge the Native peoples who are the traditional land caretakers of Central Ohio. Also, I have family over in Oregon. I noticed a lot of people in the West Coast of the US. We're thinking of you guys. I know you're suffering from the terrible fires right now. So we're hoping everybody's okay. And people from all over the world. I want to give a special shout out to everybody from the Philippines. I saw a whole bunch of people from the Philippines here. That's fantastic. And everybody who's watching where it's very late at night, you guys get bonus points for staying up late to watch this. Thank you, Zhangfen, for putting this together, and also to Ching and Nancy for organizing. As you see here, what what Layla and I were trying to do with this, in this chapter of this edited volume, was to take a look at translanguaging through the point of view of the teacher's language ideologies. And we found that thinking of this through language ideologies was a really kind of productive way of thinking about possibilities for our students to use translanguaging in the classroom. But we really need to understand that our role as teachers in the classroom is paramount. It's really, really important to sort of how do we conceptualize multilingualism and using translanguaging as a concept to think about that. So I want to go through this on behalf of Layla. But to start with, when we say language ideologies as a lens, you know, ideologies, of course, are these sort of interconnected and shared belief systems, right? And language ideologies then are the belief systems about language. And so things like standard language or monolingualism, or, you know, the various kinds of very, very powerful language ideologies that are out there that really shape the way that we think about language and shape the way that we think about like the possibilities even for using language. And so particularly in the school context and in TESOL classrooms, this is something I think we need to think really carefully about. So what Layla and I were doing, we were working in the context of an intensive English program, an IEP program at a university in the United States where most of the students were Arabic speakers. And so we looked at various classrooms and focused on the classrooms of 3 different teachers and their students. And so basically what we were doing was matching observational data of the teachers' practices, their pedagogical practices, with the interview data and how they were talking about and explaining their classrooms to try to see how does the practices of the classrooms, that the teachers and students in the classrooms can be understood through these, the language ideologies expressed in their interviews. And so our main kind of research question here, main interest, was to try to figure out how are the possibilities, the ways that teachers then either enable or constrain the possibilities for students to use translanguaging in their classes, how is that shaped through their language ideologies? And we were really looking here at sort of the implications for teacher education, and how can we, you know, working with language teachers through this concept of translanguaging, try to kind of get them to open up our minds a little bit about, you know, what are the possibilities for using multiple languages in the classroom. And so again, as I said, we focused on these 3 teachers because I think the 3 teachers kind of exemplify sort of like 3 different points on a continuum. And so what we did was we adopted, there's a very famous framework by Richard Ruiz, who's a scholar even back in the 80s in the area of bilingual education in the United States. He was talking about these language orientations, he called them, which we really should understand really as language ideologies. And he called it language as a problem, language as a right, and language as a resource. So what we did was we kind of took Ruiz's idea, took that framework, and used that to think about, well, what was the different approaches that the teachers here had to translanguaging. And so on one end of the continuum, we had this sort of translanguaging as a problem, one teacher said. Another teacher kind of somewhere in the middle sort of thought of translanguaging as just sort of something that happens, versus the teacher at the other end who really saw translanguaging, the potential of it as a resource. And so here's the examples of what this sort of sounded like, and then I'll share some of what were the pedagogical strategies that the teachers used. But so the first teacher, as I said, kind of at the one end of the continuum here, which we could say has a very monolingual language ideology there. And it's pretty much a sort of a traditional approach in TESOL then. The idea is that you have to, of course, maximize the amount of input in the target language, and that means trying to completely exclude the students' quote unquote native languages, right? And so, and this was expressed by the teacher in these ways. For example, said they should speak English even with their friends. I think it would be very detrimental to use the native language. So again, you see that sort of language reflecting a very kind of deficit idea of the student's native language. And again, from her point of view, it was like, well, if the students are going to come all the way over to the United States for this intensive English program, you know, why would they want to use Arabic? They should be completely in English. And if the teacher allows them to use Arabic, then it's just sort of, you know, just sort of condoning this, which sort of she saw as kind of like bad behavior, right? So again, a very sort of strict but fairly traditional view of the idea of any language other than English in a TESOL classroom, you know, really poses a problem. That's something that needs to be corrected, right? And she says, well, you know, in the end, of course, my students, you know, in the interview, we pressed her, well, don't, you know, the students do use Arabic, of course, right? She's like, well, yeah, she says, it would be like fighting against the tide to try to keep them from using their languages. I let them speak the language, but I look the other way. So it's sort of like begrudgingly accepting that, yeah, okay, this is going to happen, but me as the teacher, I have to try to, you know, to try to stop that where I can, and then obviously where I can't, it's like fighting against the tide, right? And so again, you can see this sort of exemplifies that idea of, or the ideology of multiple languages or translanguaging, multilingualism in the classroom as a problem. And what the teacher's role then becomes, to the extent possible, try to kind of police the language of the classroom and force students as much as possible to speak English, and where not, where that isn't possible, just try to pretend that it's not happening, essentially, right? And that, you know, she admitted that, yeah, sometimes the students, again, teachers didn't talk about this in terms of translanguaging. Translanguaging is our you know, conceptual lens that we're using to understand this. But of course, she talked about it in terms of them using their L1, right? And you can contrast that then with sort of what we thought of as more of like a middle position. So there was another teacher within the group. And again, all of these teachers are working in the same program, often working with the same groups of students. But again, you can see how even working from the same curriculum, even working from the same textbook, the teacher's ideologies then had a big impact in shaping how the students either, the potential of the students for using all of their language resources, for using translanguaging or not. And so in the view of the second teacher here, it said, well, you know, it sort of just happens, right? It's a very natural thing. Of course, our students are multilingual, so of course they're going to use their various languages, right? And even if I myself don't understand, Arabic, she says, well, the students do, of course, and they can, you know, talk through and work out things with each other in Arabic. So, you know, that's how it's going to happen, and that's fine. Right? She says here, quote, "It is natural to speak your native language with people who share your language." So again, she didn't see that as a problem, right? She also sort of didn't do anything with it because she's like, well, I don't speak Arabic, so, you know, what can I do, right? But again, that's fine if the students want to do that. So again, that was sort of like a middle position. You could say a position where it's considered okay and permissible. And then at the other end of the spectrum, where the teacher who we thought really so this is kind of what the roles or sort of the pedagogical strategies then of this teacher who sees translanguaging as natural, right? So she would sometimes, you know, have students to ask for clarification in their own language, allowing students to use bilingual dictionaries and things like that, right? Versus the teacher kind of at the other end of the spectrum, the teacher we thought kind of embodied this idea of translanguaging pedagogy, what Zhongfen was referring to. And this teacher expressed this in a way that, again, sort of directly acknowledged and tried to figure out, well, how can I use the students' multilingualism as a pedagogical resource, again, to help their English language acquisition. Said the best thing is to have an understanding of their culture, having knowledge of their educational experience, valuing their native language, and allowing them to use their language when necessary. So it's, again, in her view, not just about their language. And so translanguaging is not just about the linguistic resources that the students bring, but also the cultural resources and the educational resource, the educational background for students, right? And so again, so all of that is part of what this teacher saw as a translanguaging approach. And again, you said, well, you know, that this is something that you as a teacher can actually use if you're sort of paying attention to it, if you kind of have your like translanguaging radar almost is how I think about it. If you're sort of tuned into those moments, what we call teachable moments, where things kind of happen in the classroom that you can say, aha, now I can kind of leverage that as a teachable moment, right, to learn some particular thing. So you can see here in this sense, the teacher was actively engaged in looking for ways that translanguaging, to take advantage of translanguaging. And this is something that Kanagaraja, who talks not about, doesn't use the term translanguaging so much as translingualism, but I think it's a very related concept. And Kanagaraja talks about what he calls translingual competence. And this is kind of what we saw this teacher really exemplified that as a teacher who was very aware and sort of always looking for opportunities then, planning it to some extent where possible, but also just because of his language awareness then, and because of his understanding of the students' multiple languages, the way that they can be used for sense making and communication in the way that Zhongfen was just explaining, that was something that he was, again, actively looking for. So what we saw then was that, you know, not surprising, again, all of the students were from similar backgrounds, all of the students kind of coming to study in the same program. But again, the possibilities and the ways that the students were able to use their own translanguaging strategies, again, these were sort of things that, you know, that multilingual people kind of intuitively do when you're confronted with learning a new language, that those possibilities were really either opened up or closed down according to the language ideologies of the teachers. Again, where the teacher saw this as a problem and tried to actively shut it down, well, perhaps unsurprisingly then the students would really make an effort not to have the teacher hear them speaking Arabic, even in situations where you think that it would be, you know, you need to discuss a grammatical point or you need to sort of negotiate things with your partners. Again, because they knew that the teacher didn't like that and that the teacher would scold them if they did that, they shut it down. Versus for the other teacher who was always actively looking for it and encouraging, well, then the students themselves were like, oh yeah, teacher, how about this and how about that? And they would, you know, again, offer their own examples, right? And so again, that translanguaging, that disposition of the teacher towards translanguaging then opened up all of these, what Li Wei refers to as translanguaging spaces within the classroom. I think that's what really came out very clearly in the data. So again, just very quickly by way of conclusion then, that the teachers' orientations then were influenced by their language ideologies, and the possibilities that they either created or you know, opened up or closed down for the students really were very clearly reflected in their language ideologies. Thank you. Zhangfen, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Jamie, I think you are the next. No?
Zhangfen, just really quickly to clarify, I saw in the chat box there people were asking about sharing the slides, and we will be sharing PDFs of the slides, correct?
Yes, yes, and we will give you guys all of our contact information for the slides. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Zhangfen.
Hello, everyone. So you should be able to see my presentation slide right now. I want to quickly, before I get started, say thank you to Zhangfen, Qingqing, and Nancy for putting this together and organizing, answering a lot of my questions as we got ready. I really appreciate everything that you all did. So I'm going to get the presentation started. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you about the contribution that I worked on in our book called Pedagogical Sismo, or Earthquake, Translanguaging in English Language Teaching and Assessment in Oaxaca, Mexico. And I have the honor and privilege today to be presenting on behalf of our research team, which for this work included Julio Morales and Mario Lopez Gopar. So the presentation is framed around our research question for the chapter, which is how can we integrate translanguaging in instruction and assessment in a university TESOL classroom for pre-service English teachers. Our project is focused on efforts to mitigate differences between teaching and assessment approaches. This connects with long-standing practices in education of aligning teaching methods with assessment practices. As such, our project sought to understand the possibilities and implications of how translanguaging could be connected across teaching and assessment. So, as you can imagine, why are we working with translanguaging? So this project frames the use of students' linguistic resources as beneficial for teaching and learning, which follows the language as a resource orientation, or as Peter just talked about, translanguaging as a resource or funds of knowledge orientation. At the same time, we're engaging with the consequences of assessments within our project. Because we live in societies where what gets tested gets taught, we feel the need to actively combat inequities around assessment by examining the social implications of our work as well. For our project, we use participatory action research methods. We put together a collaborative team to actively reinscribe traditional power dynamics and interactions between the researchers and the researched. This approach is steeped in the ontological assumption that the involvement of participants in all key aspects of the research process is crucial because their knowledge is intrinsic to the production of the work. The project took place in the culturally and linguistically diverse country of Mexico. And specifically, it took place in the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico, which is the most culturally and linguistically diverse state in that country, with 8 different distinct regions that are home to 16 different ethnic groups that speak over 100 different indigenous languages. Our project took place at the university located in the capital city in the Central Valley of the mountains in the center of the state. We worked with one group of students in their 5th and 6th semester of English classes in an 8-semester long program from October 2017 until June 2018. So to tell the story of this project, I'm first going to read from Julio's insights, experiences, and reflections, and then transition into an overview of our methods for aligning assessment and teaching. For our project, we foreground Julio's trajectory and expertise as the classroom teacher, and how our work together could help to understand the day-to-day realities and pressures faced by teachers and students. So then I will shift to the specifics around assessment and focus on the analysis of the 3rd test we created, which informed our decision to continue the project for our 2nd semester. So when I use I in this part of the presentation, please note this I is in reference to Julio, who you now see in the upper right-hand corner of the slides. Okay. So as Julio. In 2015, I began a master's program in critical language studies at the university. In this program, I was asked to consider how translanguaging had been present throughout my life, including my previous studies and teaching practices. Translanguaging practices were always present, but I had largely ignored them in favor of working towards an English-only ideal, erasing the presence and utility of these translanguaging practices in the classroom especially. Even as I began to reflect on this in my own experiences and practices, I remained skeptical about the integration of translanguaging, in particular in communicating with my students about the potential pedagogical benefits of translanguaging for teaching and learning. Moreover, concerning assessments, they remained English only. Then in late 2016, I met Jamie and started collaborating with her and Mario on a research project. At this point in my teaching career, I had been shifting to use translanguaging and felt increasingly comfortable with my general approach. I was interested in expanding translanguaging in teaching. In our collaboration, translanguaging practices began to take shape in my mind as a concept that was rooted in shared experiences. On September 7th, 2017, one of the strongest earthquakes ever registered in Mexican history hit the southern Mexican states. It was a huge surprise when it happened, since when it happened was almost at midnight. Panic could be felt in the air as some of the students from the university came from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, Oaxaca, which was one of the most affected regions in Mexico. After only 2 weeks of having started the semester, the class environment was affected by this phenomenon. Students from the university were absent since they decided to visit their families and relatives to help in recovering from this event. Classes were suspended to evaluate the damage of the school building at the university. Once all buildings were evaluated as safe to re-enter, it was decided to continue classes as usual. However, a few days later, September 19th, another strong earthquake hit Mexico. This time the epicenter was located in Puebla, which is a neighboring state. These events shocked Mexican society as minor earthquakes continued to happen, and despair was reflected in the faces of everyone. Students in classes were still focused on earthquakes, and constant questions about earthquake-related vocabulary started to arise. Jamie returned to Oaxaca in October 2017 to explore the possibility of conducting a new project together. In light of these events around the earthquakes, we decided instead of conducting research similar to our previous work, that we would develop translanguaging approaches for ongoing classroom assessments that were responsive to the situations that the students were facing. So now I'm going to shift to talk about those assessments. So back to the we of the collaboration team. So we developed assessments in alignment with the grammar objectives within the course syllabus. In the fall, we worked with translanguaging approaches in 2 of the 3 assessments. In the spring, we integrated translanguaging tasks into all 3 of the assessments. The approaches included using audio and written materials in Spanish and English, the shared languages of the students, to have the students write in English for their English course. Each task had a contextual connection or topical connection in our efforts to be responsive to the interests and also expertise of the students. The third assessment in the fall semester contained 2 translanguaging tasks and 2 English-only tasks that were evenly weighted in the test for being able to compare scores. The test was scored on a 10-point scale. We compared the individual score differences between the translanguaging and English-only tasks. We reported a trend of higher scores on translanguaging tasks than on English-only tasks, noting that 5 students performed at least 2 points better on the translanguaging tasks, with 13 overall performing better on translanguaging tasks. 2 students performed better on the English-only tasks, with 5 actually performing better overall in English-only tasks, and 3 students had no difference in their performances. With these data, we surmised that there was sufficient evidence to continue our study. So if we had not found translanguaging in assessments to be not beneficial for students, we would not have continued to put in assessments, right? Because it was affecting their lives. So we saw this as sufficient evidence to continue to develop, refine, implement translanguaging assessment approaches for the following semester. But we are still acknowledging the limitations of assessments just in general as a tool to understand teaching and learning. All right. In reflecting on our project, we want to reiterate that Julio's insights, experiences, and reflections have greatly contributed to this work, which leads us to call for deeper understandings of the importance of teachers' involvement in efforts to integrate translanguaging into pedagogy and assessment in TESOL classrooms. We also feel that there is a continued need for assessments that are responsive to the day-to-day realities of those they impact, including the ways in which translanguaging may impact test performance. And finally, from these modest efforts in classroom language assessment, we hope to see continued momentum within other forms of assessment as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jamie. Now we go back to you, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, Jamie. So the last presentation here, I'm going to move pretty quickly because we do want to leave time for Q&A. The last presentation for today is based on my chapter of the book, which is the concluding chapter. So what I was trying to do was look across the, I think we had 17 or 18 chapters in the book total. And I want to give a shout out. I see some of our co-authors, our contributors of the volume are here. So thank you again to everybody who contributed to this. What I was tasked with doing in the conclusion then was trying to tie all of this together and sort of see, you know, the title of the volume is Envisioning TESOL through a Translanguaging Lens. So trying to think about, okay, so what is all of these contributions in the book? What are they telling us about the potentials of translanguaging in our field of TESOL? I first want to acknowledge really our debt here to Ofelia Garcia and the folks in bilingual education. Most of you are here in this webinar because you're members of the TESOL's bilingual, multilingual education interest section, right? And so again, you guys understand that part of the multilingual turn in TESOL, part of TESOL as a field, acknowledging and recognizing the value of multilingualism is an important direction to go. And so we see translanguaging then is giving us kind of a very useful concept, something that we can really sink our teeth into, something that we can really work with here to sort of understand how can we help continue to make this multilingual turn in TESOL. So we definitely want to recognize our intellectual debt to Garcia and the folks in bilingual education, and sort of seeing again this part of this, that our interest in translanguaging and our sort of contribution here in this volume and with all the contributions in this volume as contributing to re-envisioning TESOL as plurilingual education. And so here the premise is a really simple one, right? The premise is that we should think about our TESOL classrooms as multilingual spaces. that like doesn't seem like a stretch, right? Because again, our students come from all sorts of different language backgrounds. Our students by definition are trying to develop their bilingualism or multilingualism. So again, thinking of TESOL as our classrooms as multilingual spaces, it really shouldn't be you know, too far-fetched. But again, that's not really traditionally how we've thought of classrooms in TESOL, right? Classrooms in TESOL, again, have been defined by and maximizing the input in the target language, meaning trying to get as close to 100% English as we can, being very skeptical of the quote unquote role of the L1, and again, seeing students in terms of their interlanguage and something that needs to be fixed, right? And so again, if we make that sort of conceptual or sort of shift in our thinking towards translanguaging, I think for us as TESOL educators, then it becomes a very practical problem of, well, how then do we use languages? How is the use of languages organized in our classroom? In the previous presentation, Leila's presentation, we were sort of showing again how teachers open up or close down spaces. But then we're thinking, okay, well, so how do we organize that, right? And what types of multilingual practices can support language learning? Again, we got to keep in mind, okay, we're in TESOL. Our main goal is to help folks learn English for whatever their social purposes are. But we do need to keep in mind that that's really the end goal, at least for most of our students, right? And so as I think Zhongfen did a really nice job in the introduction then of sort of explaining how from different perspectives, theoretical and pedagogical, how translanguaging then embodies this sort of flexible heteroglossic approach, which is also, if you've dug into Garcia's work at all, you see that it's really what we would call a critical post-structural view of language. I think conceptually here, I think that poses some problems, and this is kind of in the concluding chapter. I've gone through this a little bit more, but what I've called the named language problem and the multilingual resources versus good English's problem. Just very quickly, think about the named language problem is Garcia talks about, and kind of drawing from McConey and Pennycook's work in this idea of languages as inventions, right? Languages as sort of social or political inventions that don't really have a corresponding linguistic reality. But if we think about, well, named languages like English is just an invention. Obviously that poses a big conceptual problem to us in TESOL, right? The E is for English. There must be something called English because that's what we're trying to teach folks. If you think about the parallel from world Englishes, for those of you who, you know, Taglish or Singapore English or Indian English, they've taken the opposite view and tried to sort of legitimize varieties of world Englishes by sort of naming them and describing them, right? Here in translanguaging, what we're trying to do is sort of call into question that whole premise of named languages, especially as it creates kind of a hierarchy of sort of powerful, prestigious languages at the top and local languages kind of at the bottom, right? And so again, but for English, then we need to really carefully think about, for TESOL at least, we need to carefully think about what are the implications of that. Also, we see very strong implications for translanguaging and teacher education. So there's several chapters in the book, there are a whole section that looks particularly at, well, how do we use the concept of translanguaging for those of us who are working in teacher education? What the takeaway there is that one of the central goals of language teacher education should be to counteract the prevailing or dominant monolingual ideologies of TESOL. Again, as I said, TESOL is a field the field was sort of developed and is really still rooted in monolingual ideologies of the idea, again, of being that we need to save the students from their defective interlanguage by teaching them perfect English, right? And so anything we need to get over that. Also, what you see come through very clearly there is the idea that within translanguaging, again, it goes beyond just the sort of the language, the linguistic part, and it goes into also the idea that language education, and particularly, you know, the reasons why people want to become multilingual and to learn English is to gain access to different social possibilities, right? And so we see language teaching as very much bound up with social justice issues, which of course, from all of the events of this year, we're even more aware of that. And as we see, that kind of goes along with the idea of praxis. Praxis is the connection between theory and practice, right? And so always kind of looking at both pieces of that. And I think, again, Zhangfen, you did a really nice job of sort of positioning yourself and your work at the very beginning. And again, translanguaging, again, engages with those issues of identity and who we are as both teachers and students, right? And so again, I think these are all aspects of it. And from the idea then that that we're trying to think about what's sort of a healthy, productive interrelationship of languages within our classrooms. We do need to recognize, though, that schools and classrooms tend to be spaces where language is heavily regimented, right? Standard language, monolingual language, these are all, again, very powerful language ideologies that, again, sort of frame what is even possible within language classrooms, what Cross-Critti referred to as regimes of language, right? And so again, we need to be cognizant of that. Li Wei talks about, again, opening up translanguaging spaces, which again sounds great, but we need to think, like, in practical terms, how do we actually do that? How do I as a teacher try to open up these translanguaging spaces within my classroom? What does that look like, right? And as I said, ultimately, I think Ofelia Garcia is challenging us to think about what she calls these functional interrelationships of languages in our school. So I noticed in the chat box, for example, Dr. Difaf from Iraq is saying that he teaches Renaissance poetry to second-year Iraqi students, and he's thinking about, again, cultural connections that he can make within that, which I think is great. That's really cool. Again, and thinking about all of the different sort of ways that, again, before I started, engaging with Jamie and Zhangfen about this, hadn't really sort of thought about, much more broadly about what are the possibilities for translanguaging within TESOL. And I think that's really what this volume accomplishes, is that all of these different sort of geographical contexts for TESOL, but also, all of the other types of contexts, CLIL classrooms, or like he mentioned here, Renaissance poetry, I'd never would have occurred to me, right? And so again, thinking about what are the possibilities in all of these different approaches, pedagogies, methods of TESOL, and even things like TBLT, is task-based language teaching. And when I was reading the chapter, there's a chapter in the book about using task-based language teaching and pedagogy. I think of task-based as like a very kind of cognitively oriented, which sort of theoretically doesn't seem to mesh with translanguaging. But again, I think that, as Zhangfen is saying, we can think about how these sort of approaches can be married, how can they be combined, right? And thinking about both on the pedagogical side and on the SLA, or the acquisition side. I think it challenges us to think about, to what extent does translanguaging have to be about language acquisition, and to what extent is it about these other issues of praxis and identity and things like that. And Jamie, I thought you did a really nice job even thinking about something that we think of as very reductionist almost as assessment, but again, for her work with the teachers there in Mexico, really opening up a whole other set of possibilities, and even engaging with something like the recent events of the earthquake that are happening to us in our real lives, right? Making those sorts of connections through translanguaging. And I'd encourage you to go farther with this. This is a resource that, again, Ofelia Garcia has done some wonderful work with colleagues here in the US. And so I would say Google these sorts of resources. Again, these are really nice practical guides that really lay out for classroom teachers, how can you work this. I use these resources extensively in my teacher education courses, and would encourage you to look for that. And on the research side, I would challenge you guys, all of you who are in this webinar today, to think about, as researchers, well, how do you document this, right? What we want is to be able to sort of show evidence of, this is the potential of translanguaging. This is what translanguaging can do. And so how do you do that? How do you sort of show the evidence? What are your data there? And so, for example, even if you think about it in sort of a 4 skills approach, right? Here's one from an L2 writing classroom, and here's how the teacher was using translanguaging to support drafts of the student's academic writing. Here was one sort of based on an oral language classroom using transcripts of recordings to show sort of from an interactional point of view how translanguaging works in a spoken language classroom, right? So again, thinking of different ways and thinking about what your data would be and how are you showing what is the role of translanguaging, what is translanguaging doing at these different moments. And again, I say translanguaging then is sort of part of this broader trend of the multilingual turn in TESOL. And again, thinking about sort of how this represents a paradigm shift from multilingualism to dynamic bilingualism, and a paradigm shift in terms of all of the things in the left-hand side of this column here to the right-hand side. So again, using translanguaging kind of as our entry point to thinking of this much broader multilingual approach to TESOL. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think that was a wonderful concluding remark for our presentation. And you also sort of addressed some of the questions from the chat box. So we have an overwhelming response from the chat box. I was trying to, in the meantime, reply to some of your questions and provide some resources. So I see we are actually around, it's 11 Eastern time right now. Chin, I don't know. Do we still allow folks to have some Q&A time? I know folks also have other things to do, or shall we announce the winners first?
Yes, maybe we can extend for 5 minutes.
Sure,
For
yeah.
Q&A.
Yeah, so now it's the Q&A session. I don't know if you have some burning questions that you want to ask. I think you can unmute yourself or just speak up, or you can put your questions in the chat box now. And we have question now. I think so. The one I'm seeing now, how does translanguaging work when students write and are assessed?
Do you want me to address that one?
Sure, yeah.
Maybe. That's tricky. So it really depends on the different, I think, design and kind of what you're trying to do with the assessment. So if you're trying to elicit translanguaging, one of the things I've actually pushed back against in a different body of work, a special issue on the construct of multilingualism and language assessment, is not creating a translanguaging scale, right? Like assessment often, as Peter was saying, becomes reductionistic. And so in terms of assessing translanguaging in writing, the idea of trying to say, like, this is advanced translanguaging versus novice translanguaging is something I have argued against. In terms of writing, it's really what you get to decide, right? Like if you're doing classroom-based assessments, in our early part of the project, students were writing in Spanish and English, and we actively chose not to grade them, change their grade based on that, right? Because we wanted to value translanguaging. So that was another way that we integrated it.
I think we probably have.
We can move on to another question. Yeah.
Hi, this is Lavinia Khosrow from University of Glasgow. Nice to meet everybody. It's been a wonderful 1 hour spent together. I really enjoyed all the presentations, and as you were talking, in the back of my mind, I was thinking that, you know, we've all worked very hard to build a critical mass of scholars to unpack what the concept is, a critical mass of teachers who will pick this up, trying to work through what the implications are for assessment. So I wonder if from your experiences and projects, did you see effects at the policy level or at the other, you know, the other constraints that sometimes we get to push back from? I've been involved in a project where I was working with teachers as well, and totally on board with the concepts, you know, very excited about changing classroom practice. They did it, but there, you know, there was always the lingering force of the school, you know, what's expected of us. So I was wondering what your experience has been in your projects in terms of, you know, pushing up against those bigger constraints.
Peter, would you like to address this?
Sure. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Thank you, Lavinia, for the question. And I think that's a matter of sort of, yeah, pushing things out, right? How does this critical work sort of at the forefront here? And as you're saying, there's a critical mass now of research, but how do we sort of help, you know, educators as we're trying to think about, you know, how do we apply this to the classroom? So I think, you know, we've been learning a lot from, you know, the teachers who have been doing this. And so we as researchers can point to these are our master teachers who are doing a wonderful job of that. But you're right, how do we reflect that now in the way that we're building curricula and sort of at the sort of the policymakers sense, right? And so I think that the first step is, you know, we are integrating now this into teacher education programs. So for those of you working in teacher education, that's where I wanted to emphasize that, so that, you know, the young folks going out and teaching this sort of equipped with the latest and greatest. There's like this is the latest and greatest, right? This is what I'm bringing. And so how do we sort of push back often at the level of, yeah, the curricula and the policies, which are much more conservative? How do we push back against that, right? And so I think you're right. Is sort of how do we again get into other space, sort of get an audience with those folks. You know, I'm on the Ohio Department of Education Advisory Board, and so trying to kind of put my 2 cents in there, right? And so I think getting involved in different ways where your voice then can affect that change, and getting people to think about this. Again, you don't necessarily have to be like whipping out, but translanguaging, but you do want to think about, well, how do I articulate that argument in a way that's going to kind of make sense or resonate with the folks who are making these decisions, right? And I think that basic idea of, you know, the language as resource view, I think it's really hard to argue against that, right? Really hard to say, but the kids shouldn't use their language as a resource. Like, who would say that, right? And so again, I think finding the way to make those arguments, maybe, you know, we understand that as translanguaging, we understand sort of the theory behind that, but finding a way to kind of express that and make that argument with policy makers is a really important skill that, you know, we need to develop as educators as well, right? So thank you, Lavinia, for that.